resume.
Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison for the Conservation Coalition continuing. Mr. Carter, I was hoping to just get some very brief sort of clarifications on the ground on what staff actually does when they get to sites. And I asked you about this before about inspection powers and the like, but I'm wondering, your staff, your monitoring staff, in the while they're doing monitoring or compliance monitoring, would collecting evidence be a forefront in their minds and in their purposes for later investigation?
All of them are habitat biologists and I guess have had experience with or potentially with gathering evidence in terms of enforcement activity. And some of that monitoring information they were gathering in terms of the project, how it was built, what the effects might have been, all could potentially be evidence. So the information they are gathering has the potential to be evidence, as opposed to making the decision to gather evidence in support of an investigation. That would be something that would occur once an occurrence was identified. And it would depend on the situation as to, I guess, the timeliness with which that information would need to be gathered. So if it was something where there was an ongoing situation, they could well gather that information. If it was something that maybe wasn't time dependent, they might actually contact the biologist in the area and ask them to be involved in gathering that type of information. So it would depend on the circumstance, but yes, they could.
Okay, so in cases of occurrences, if one of your staff members saw what they deemed to be a clear HAD violation, would they need an officially to claim that to be an occurrence, or from that point forward, would they start collecting evidence on that?
When we do our monitoring, we could identify that there was a non-compliance where an unauthorized impact to habitat has occurred. Then in terms of how that occurrence is responded to, we could speak about that compliance decision framework and the evaluation that would need to be done to determine sort of what level of response was appropriate. And that compliance decision framework lays out an orderly approach to doing that based on compliance risk and the impact to the habitat. So if you're asking if the impact of the habitat was significant enough and it appeared that the compliance risk was high enough, would they gather information that could then be used as evidence? Yes, they would.
Yeah, and I guess my question was, in the majority of circumstances, if they came across what they determined was likely a HAD, would that then lead to collecting evidence of that and taking sample and photographic evidence? Or it seems to me, as you're saying, it wouldn't. Instead, they'd go back and make determinations on what level of risk it fits into. And
there would still be information gathered, though, that could be deemed as evidence if it was decided that an investigation needed to be followed up on. So, they would be collecting pertinent information about the site, what was done there, what the project was, whether it was built as proposed, gathering that sort of site information, including photographic information that could become evidence. It would depend on, there would need to be a decision made as to whether this was something that needed to be investigated or not.
Before the break, I asked you about your staff only going out to places where an authorization has been issued or where letters of advice have been given with respect to a project. My understanding of EPMP is that it has reduced significantly the amount of referrals that Habitat staff will receive, so that there'd be a lot less projects that actually do obtain an authorization or letters of advice. Is that right, or I see you?
Well, I guess, I'm not the expert in EPMP or that policy. My understanding of it is that under EPMP there was some attempt made to, I guess, identify some lower risk projects and have them enter into the process through another means, being the operational statements, where projects could be dealt with an operational statement would be done that way and with a voluntary notification. I'm not sure, and I guess that may have reduced maybe the number of letters of advice, because some of those letters of advice could have been converted to being dealt with by operational statements. But in terms of authorizations, if a harmful impact to habitat could not be avoided, I wouldn't see the number of those being changed by EPMP.
Earlier today, you said that last season was a learning year, and one of the largest lessons that you learned, according to your words, it was there was an insufficiency in the availability of information. I would just like you to elaborate upon that and tell us, what information do you not have and how that can be remedied.
I guess what I was speaking to was information available in the project files.
Okay.
So, and that would be a lot of the information that we would base our monitoring upon. So, what was the project design? What were the conditions? What was the state of the habitat at the site prior to the project? Was there photographic information or other habitat information about what was there prior to the project going on? If we're going to compare what was there before versus what was there after, unless we know what was there before, it makes it difficult. So that sort of information being available in project files, we found, sometimes that information just wasn't available. Other times it was difficult to obtain. So.
Okay. Thank you for that. And this will be my last question. You spoke about just now about the status of habitat or a baseline study, how that would be a good thing. Earlier this morning, I heard you say that this was fairly key, to paraphrase what you said. My question to you is there a risk that the longer that we wait to do such a baseline study, the more habitat is lost in the interim?
Of course. I mean, if there is habitat loss occurring now, which I think a number of the people who've testified before me have suggested that there is, the longer you wait to gather that inventory or establish that baseline, the incremental losses are occurring. So yes. And the earlier we have that baseline to compare with, the more useful it might be.
Okay, and related, in the document that, it was made an exhibit, and it was a 2011 document that you were working on, the regional,
our framework, our habitat monitoring framework.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Within that document, you say that you hope to do fish health, habitat health monitoring within the next 5 years, implement that. Do you feel that that is a adequate timeline?
The date that was included in the regional framework was taking a cue from the national direction. You saw that national document with sort of a 5-year horizon. To meet that 5-year horizon, obviously we would have to be doing a lot of upfront work, establishing the tools, the methodologies, and the means to do that. So, it wouldn't be suggested that we wouldn't be making efforts in that direction, but in terms of having it fully established and up and operational, I don't think that's necessarily an unreasonable timeline to get it right. So.
Okay, thank you. And the document I was referring to is Exhibit 678, and I apologize for not saying that beforehand.
Mr. Commissioner, next on the list is Mr. Rosenblum. My note is 30 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. My name is Don Rosenblum. I appear on behalf of Area D, Gilnet, Area B, Sainer. Mr. Carter, thank you for answering my questions. I have only 2 areas of focus in terms of my cross-examination of you. The first area of focus relates to the level of completeness or incompleteness in the monitoring regime that is currently being pursued by DFO regionally. And the second area of my focus will relate to budgetary issues and how the budgetary situation restricts the capacity of your group to carry out what might be said to be a statutory responsibility. I'd like to go to the first of my 2 areas of focus. I want to focus not so much on what you have been able to complete in terms of analysis of compliance, monitoring and compliance, but rather I want to focus on what is left as the unknown. In other words, what is left that is not being monitored, and obviously leave it to others and ourselves to argue at the end of the day whether there should be a more complete initiative in terms of monitoring. Before us is Exhibit 679, and I believe, if I'm following the evidence, this is the interim work you did in 2010 to give some sense of to what extent there is a compliance being compliance that in fact you are satisfied is meeting standard or indeed isn't meeting standard. And if you could go to page 10 of that document. I thought it was page 10. Actually, what I'm looking for, and council can assist me, is, I thought that document, but it's...
Are you looking for the table?
Yes, the table. There we go. Thank you. Now, I want to understand this table. As I understand your testimony, firstly, let's put on record, and I think it's clear already, that your focus in terms of monitoring is limited in the sense that you're not even speaking to environmental monitoring or ecosystem monitoring. You have made clear you are speaking to a focus in monitoring that relates to project initiatives. Could I put it that way? You might have a better term of phrase.
I guess, in terms of the monitoring that we're conducting currently, it is project-based monitoring, and initially we are looking at compliance in relation to those projects.
Precisely. I'm sorry, yes, go ahead.
But with the expectation that there is going to be the addition of effectiveness monitoring in relation to those projects and the effects of those projects, and then future into looking at ecosystem level monitoring, but those are future goals.
Yes, and so let's speak or focus on the status quo of what you're doing now and what this table represents that is before us on the screen. As I understand it, and again, please correct me.
Sure.
This table speaks to an initiative to monitor either projects that were subject to referral, in other words, where the voluntary regime took place and somebody filed, or, as I understand it, alternatively, they are projects where notice came to you, and that notice came to you because of operational statements that your region has put out that has encouraged parties initiating certain projects to at least give notice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And just so we spoon feed here for a moment, I'm led to believe that the operational statements are the areas where operational statements apply would be found at page 115 of the PPR number 8. Let me just put it up so we have it as a matter of record. Page 115 of PPR 8.
Well, this would be the operational statement specific to clear span bridges.
Yes, and let me, if I may, just show this to you, and if you would identify it, and then we'll put it on the screen. I'm looking at this document here, which is part of a notification form, is it not?
Correct. Yes, it is.
And and
these are the operational statements that are applicable in British Columbia.
That is correct.
Right.
And it is now on the screen. Thank you very much. Have I
I'm just
now?
going to preserve the record by saying this is Appendix 6 to the PPR number 8.
Thank you. Now, so am I right in stating that the analysis you did, which was just on the screen a moment ago, was an analysis limited to the areas we've just spoken about?
Yes, you would be correct.
All right. I want to focus on the areas that you have failed to do monitoring. I'm not criticizing you in the slightest, but that aren't part of the record of your work with DFO. Can I assume that all projects or initiatives where individuals have chosen not to file referrals with the department are off the radar screen unless they have given notification under this document now before you.
I guess I need clarification off of the habitat monitoring units radar
Yes.
screen.
Yes.
That would be a reasonable assessment, but not necessarily off the radar screen of the rest of the habitat program nor CNP.
All right. But in terms of a study to determine the extent to which the public are complying with your regulations and statute, can I assume that DFO has to rely regionally, at least, solely on the 2010 document that is before us?
So in terms of a monitoring study, I would say yes. In
And
terms
so-
of, yeah.
Yes, and so to speak of the fear of the unknown, is it fair to say that we don't know, or more to the point, you don't know as a DFO, to what extent, let's say firstly, individuals or companies are failing to comply and have chosen not to file voluntary referral, nor have they, and they've failed to give notification to you?
I think there are a couple of avenues where that kind of information could be gathered or is being gathered. We made reference to the shoreline inventory program that was being done on Shuswap. That would have identified a lot of projects that didn't go through any formal permitting or referral process, but were identified, as well as regular patrols, either by CMP staff or Habitat staff. But in terms of the monitoring staff, you would be correct. We're not out there looking for those currently.
And is it appropriate to term the voluntary system of filing for referral almost an honor system?
I guess much like a speeding ticket, in that there is a risk inherent in not referring. That if you did do something and you did end up out of compliance with the act, there might be the potential of being prosecuted.
Right.
So I guess yes. I mean, it is voluntary, but there is a knowledge that, or there should be a knowledge that if you don't adhere to the rules, you might be.
Yes, and you happen to have the good fortune of being here yesterday and hearing the exchanges in cross-examination about the possibility that there was only one conviction in British Columbia last year.
Yes,
You heard that evidence.
I did. Yes.
That's the deterrent you're speaking about?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I want to continue to focus on the second prong of the voluntariness of this program. The first one being to file for a referral. The second one, to give notice if one is pursuing one of these initiatives as set out on the screen right now. In respect to the obligation on the second prong, there is no statutory obligation. It too is a voluntary discretion.
Yes, the notifications with regard to the operational statements are voluntary.
Right. Now, to what extent should the public be concerned of the unknowns here? In other words, the initiatives that individuals or companies are taking that are choosing not to seek referral, that are choosing not to give notification from a policy operational basis. What does the department know of what they're missing?
I think as you posted, it is somewhat an unknown. So I would hazard to put a number to that, or to put an estimate to it.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
It would be a hazard for me to try and put a number or an estimate to that. As you've correctly phrased it, it is somewhat an unknown.
Doesn't that keep you up at night?
It's definitely a concern.
Isn't it also a concern to your colleagues within the habitat monitoring field?
I think it would be a concern, though there are other avenues for that information to be made available to the department.
Well, when you say there are other avenues to allow this information to be made available, is it being made available? What are those avenues, and why, if those avenues are available, why is it not being obtained by DFO so that you could come here today and answer the simple question, to what extent are we missing it?
Well, I think where you'll be able to get an answer to the question would be probably in the next couple of days when you're talking to the compliance side of it, there are, I guess, things in this region, such as we do have a report line. There is a 1-800 number where people who see things going on in their area or in their neighborhood, they can phone in and report that they've seen an incident that they think might be a violation of the Fisheries Act. So there is information on how many of those incident reports occur within the region, which would probably give a feel for, you could evaluate how many of those are associated with projects that have been reviewed versus how many of those are on projects that have not been reviewed. So I guess that would be a way of getting a handle on some of that information.
But we have a large sea of unknowns here, don't we?
I would say there are some unknowns.
And I appreciate you're not a legislator. You obviously didn't pass the act and regulations. Can you explain to me the motive behind DFO choosing to approach this area of compliance in a totally voluntary schematic?
I think you phrased it well. I'm not a legislator. I didn't write the legislation as to how it is written, so I don't know that I'm the right person to pose that question to.
Do you and your colleagues within Habitat Monitoring regionally complain to headquarters that there isn't the teeth that there should be in the statute, so that you could feel comfortable that your radar's catching most of these incidents?
I don't know that I've personally made that complaint. I think there's a recognition that there are a lot of things going on out there that we're probably not aware of, that we would be beneficial if we were, or that should have come through the referral process.
And sadly, if you had more staff, you might become aware of more incidents than obviously you can possibly investigate.
Yes, though I think it's also important to go back to some of the things that were discussed previously under the habitat policy, and that there's a number of different, I guess, strategies under that policy that could address some of these issues, such as education, promotion, some of those other things as well. So that are tools as well that could be used in this.
Mm-hmm. I want to now come to the second area of my focus, which relates to budgetary issues. And again, yesterday you had the opportunity to hear exchanges about budgetary problems and how it causes a consequence in the field of monitoring and compliance. You would agree with me, would you not, that the budgetary restrictions that DFO is facing year by year is obviously to the prejudice of the monitoring program within your branch?
Budgetary restrictions that affect operational funding obviously will influence how much time we can spend in the field, the resources towards that. So it does have implications on monitoring and how much monitoring can be done, yes.
And you also heard testimony yesterday, and I'm sure you are well aware of this, that there's no reason to be optimistic, certainly for this present fiscal year, correct?
Yes.
And you've had no information to cause you to be optimistic in terms of the next year or two?
In terms of there being an increase, no, I've not.
No. And that being the case, is it fair to say that your prognosis in terms of what can be accomplished in the way of monitoring, of compliance over the next couple of years, we can't look forward to an aggressive increase in your surveillance of this area of your responsibilities?
I guess I have to address that. Last year was the first year where the monitoring unit was out actively doing compliance monitoring. So there were, in the neighborhood of 600 visits conducted that weren't conducted the previous year. So there has been an increase, but in terms of whether there will be subsequent increases in the future years, I would agree with you that it's not likely that level is going to increase.
And that's a very unfavorable situation for you and your area and your mandate, is it not?
I guess it does cause me concerns when we have a plan of not only implementing compliance monitoring, but also effectiveness monitoring and into ecosystem health monitoring. I think all of those endeavors would involve increased levels of field time, which would be a challenge.
Appreciating what you have just said, you were here yesterday and probably heard an exchange between myself and Monsieur Leblanc and indeed Ms. Reid about whether their recent budgets as advanced to Treasury Board included an increased line item for, or an increase for funding for monitoring. Did you hear that exchange?
I did hear a discussion, yes.
And you heard both these witnesses indicate, if my memory's right of the testimony, that to the best of their memory, no, the region nor the national headquarters had applied for increased funding for habitat monitoring. Do you remember?
Yeah, I'm not aware of an increase, a request for increase.
Okay. Was there an application for an increase in funding by your group to Region, asking Region to fight the good battle with Treasury Board through headquarters?
Not formally, not in writing, but there have been conversations indicating that there would be operational funding necessary to conduct the field monitoring. So there's been discussions, but no formal request.
Please, without in any way being interpreted to be critical of you, sir, can you explain to me why your group would not be taking a more assertive initiative with Region to top up your funding so that you would be able to sleep at night?
I think the expectation is that, we've been made aware that, increases in funding were unlikely, and that, there was an expectation you were going to have to make do with what was available. So that would be, I guess, the impetus for not pursuing that avenue.
Appreciating how your initiatives are limited by the funding problems, do you think the public interest is being well served at this time in terms of DFO carrying out its monitoring program?
Comes down to an issue of, doing the best you can with the resources available.
Doesn't quite answer my question. I appreciate your response.
Yeah.
Do you think the public interest is being well served right now?
I think we could do more with more. Which is maybe, I'm not trying to hedge the response there. Would it be beneficial to do more monitoring? Of course it would. Would more resources being available facilitate it? Yes, it would. I think that probably answers your question.
Do you ever have the opportunity to meet American colleagues and discuss matters relating to monitoring of the fishery resource?
Not since I've been back with DFO, no.
And so you cannot bring to this inquiry any knowledge of whether the Americans are doing a more effective job in monitoring their fish habitat?
I'm aware of some of the programs that are ongoing in the United States, because obviously we're looking at some of those as potential things that we could apply here, things that are being done by the EPA, things that are being done by the U.S. Geological Survey. So I'm aware of some of those initiatives, but I haven't had direct discussions with.
I appreciate that, and the fact that you are looking at this American experience, is it fair to say from your perspective that they are discharging more effectively the monitoring of habitat in the U.S. than we are here?
I haven't done a thorough evaluation of their methodology or of the approach they're taking and the results that they're getting. So I don't think I would be qualified to answer that question.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for your questions, answers, I should say. Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, I have next Mr. Harvey at 10 minutes.
Chris Harvey for the Area G Trawlers and the UFAWU. Mr. Carter, as you know, this commission is mandated to investigate the causes for the decline of the Fraser River sockeye fishery. Yes. And your work, I take it, covers all fisheries related habitat. issues throughout the province.
And the Yukon.
Yes, all right. But with respect to sockeye and Fraser River sockeye in particular, do you have priorities for your monitoring and compliance work?
Well, there are a number of priorities I think I mentioned earlier that we use to develop our work plans, and some of those were national, regional, as well as area-specific priorities.
Yes, I didn't mean in the sense of policies. I mean in geographic location. We've heard a lot of evidence here about the importance of the spawning grounds, of course, but also the rearing lakes, because the juvenile sockeye spend almost half the lifespan of sockeye in the lakes. And lakes have a certain carrying capacity that's critical to their future survival and growth. Has somebody come to you ever and said, look, we've got to focus on the Shuswap, or we've got to focus on the Cultus, or the Quesnel system is very important? That sort of thing.
There have been, as I said, some regional priorities identified. One of them, being sockeye and this, I guess, commission. Some of that priority did influence some of the projects that were included in our monitoring work plans. So we actually were involved in the shoreline monitoring initiative that was done in the Shuswap. So I guess it would influence some of the projects that were included in our work plan.
With respect to that shoreline inventory program in the Shuswap, I think you said is that going to be part of the report, the regional report that will be developed from the habitat monitoring update?
There was actually, through the SLIP program, there was already a report generated regarding the Shuswap shoreline monitoring initiative. That has already been published, is my understanding, and it was published as a joint venture between mainly the province, the regional district, DFO. So that report already exists.
All right. Well, I'm sorry, I haven't seen it, but maybe you can tell me this. Is there any connection or any analysis in that work, of the effect of habitat changes on the carrying capacity of the lake?
To be honest, I couldn't tell you whether that analysis was included in the report or not.
I see. I'm going to just refer to the transcript of February 10th for a moment. Page 56. There was a short discussion here, and there's been discussion elsewhere on the Cultus, because that really seems to be one of the bottlenecks that's causing problems in the sockeye fishery. And this is part of cross-examination of Dr. Walters, one of the eminent population dynamics scientists in the area, starting at line 13. He says the stock, he's referring to the Cultus stock here, was relatively healthy. It was relatively stable in abundance, so it didn't show show cyclic patterns. It wasn't until the 70s that it started to decline and moved into cyclic pattern, at least according to the escapement records of the Salmon Commission. And he's asked, fairly heavy population pressure in the Cultus, is that fair to say? He agrees. Recreational development such as boating cabins, he agrees. Docks, a boat launching site right next to one of the preferred beaches for sockeye, and he agrees, and he says there's a whole bunch of other things impacting them. Now this lake system is one in which the sockeye actually spawn in the lake, as well as the lake also supports the fry as a rearing habitat. Can you describe what work your section does with respect to monitoring and compliance in the Cultus?
If there were projects proposed that were reviewed, there is a good potential that they would come up and be identified for monitoring in relation to the habitat monitoring program. So I can't, off the top of my head, recall any projects that were done in Cultus Lake last year that were monitored. But if they did, apply for a Fisheries Act authorization or received a letter of advice, there's a good potential that we would go out and monitor them.
So no one in the department has come to you and said, look, the habitat conditions in the Cultus are causing millions of dollars of loss to the economy of the province. We've got to focus on it as a priority. That sort of thing is not happening?
That has not happened.
No. All right. I have no further questions. Thank you.
I have Ms. Brown for First Nations Coalition at 30 minutes.
We're council for the First Nations Coalition, and the coalition is made up of First Nations from the lower to the upper Fraser, as well as the Council of Haida Nation, and we also represent a number of Fraser River Aboriginal organizations. Mr. Carter, a few minutes earlier you made reference to 600 visits that your unit engaged in last year, and I'm wondering if you're able to break that down into at least an approximate number of projects that represents.
I would be, I mean, I'd have to look at the number and identify it. I would say in the neighborhood of 400.
And are you able-
individual projects or projects that had specific path numbers in our file system?
Are you able to give us an idea of how many of those would have been located on the Fraser River?
Based on the number that occurred either through the Lower Fraser group or through the BCI group, I'd say 40 to 50%.
So around 200?
200 projects. So.
All right. Now, you've testified that you have 12 staff that are dedicated to monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us the number of those 12 staff that work out of Fraser River area offices, either on the lower or the interior offices?
That would be 4.
And can you tell us which office they're working out of?
Well, actually, it would be 5, now that I think about it. There's 2 in the Annacis Island office in the Lower Fraser. There's 2 in Kamloops and 1 in Prince George.
And what about the 60 to 70 additional staff that you estimated provided about 5% of their time to support your 12 staff? Are you able to give us an idea of how many of those are from Fraser River offices?
In terms of organizational structure, it would be better to ask somebody else, to be honest. I'm not sure exactly how many staff are in each of the individual offices. So,
Are you able to give us an idea of full-time equivalents or anything like that?
not one that I would rely on.
All right. Now, you've talked about the field season, and I'm curious, does the field season stop and start on a specific date regionally, or is that something that's determined on an area basis?
It's determined on an area basis. Obviously, it's somewhere like the Yukon, the field season is going to be relatively short because of ice and snow, whereas in the Lower Mainland or in South Coast, the field season actually may run for most of the year because they have access to the sites.
All right, and when you were referring to your field season earlier in testimony, what were the specific dates that you were referring to there?
I guess the approach is we do our planning and our work planning right now in the spring. Usually field programs sort of start April into May, run May through the summer into September, October, and then we would be moving, after October, we would be moving more into the analysis and starting to write up the results.
So there's a good chunk of the year then where there's no monitoring at all taking place, is that right?
It would vary by area and accessibility. So in some areas you might have monitoring going on most of the year, like I said, down the Lower Fraser. In other areas where there's ice and snow and there isn't the access, you're right, there would be a winter season where it wouldn't be very reasonable to be attempting to do monitoring.
Right. Now, is the actual level of monitoring dependent on the nature of a particular project? And what I mean by that is the number of visits that a particular project might be subject to.
There is the potential, especially with very large projects or linear projects, where there might be multiple site visits involved. There are also smaller projects where a single site visit might be adequate to evaluate the situation. So yes, it's going to vary by the nature of the project as to how many site visits are involved.
And are those visits unannounced, or is the proponent aware of scheduled visits?
Somewhat variable. I would assume a number of them are, on Crown land. We would just factor that into our work planning. Others that might be on private property, or, if we needed to gather some information from the proponent, we might contact the proponent in advance of the site visit to confirm that, the work was actually ongoing and that the work was being done. One of the things we found with the notification process is often when we receive notifications, we went into the field to go monitor the project and it hadn't been constructed. So obviously, adding an element of contact the proponent in advance to confirm they'd actually done the work was useful.
In answer to one of the questions posed by Ms. Tessero, and her question was, why monitor? Your answer was that it was important to ensure that when DFO provides conditions or advice, that advice is adhered to, and that obviously this creates an incentive on the proponent to be compliant. And later, when speaking with Mr. Taylor, you said that effects monitoring is something that would be undertaken by proponents. Did I understand your evidence correctly in that regard?
Well, that if some of the effects monitoring could be done by proponents. So I think there's an expectation that some of that effects monitoring could be done by Habitat staff, and some of that effects monitoring could be done by proponents or people working for proponents as part of their follow-up program.
So where there's an aspect of effects monitoring that's undertaken by a proponent, what happens to the incentive to comply where you have a proponent who's doing essentially monitoring itself?
Well, first of all, I guess a lot of that monitoring is third-party monitoring, where they actually hire a consulting company or a professional to do that monitoring on their behalf. There's also the other side of it too, is just because a proponent has a monitor on site, that doesn't necessarily remove or negate us going out and doing monitoring on that project and sort of verifying that information that's being gathered.
And what would determine whether there would be that additional layer of monitoring by the department taking place?
We would do that when we establish our samples. So most of the authorizations that we monitored this year also had a follow-up monitoring that was being done by a third-party monitor hired by the proponent. So when those projects were identified in our sample, we went out and monitored them as well. So it's determined by how we choose to sample.
Now, in the evidence you gave earlier today in response to questions posed by Mr. Taylor, you indicated that one of the ways that DFO chooses its priorities for strategic monitoring is based on integrating national, regional, and area priorities. And if I heard your evidence correctly, is this an internal exercise then?
Yes.
All right. And some of the priorities that you mentioned were seawall developments and docks and bridges. And we noted that you didn't mention dams or hydro developments as a priority. And my question is why projects such as that because such projects affect fish, why wouldn't those sorts of projects be identified as strategic priorities?
I guess should be careful. In terms of something being a priority, it might be a particular issue that was identified as a priority, and then we would identify particular projects to go out and monitor to speak to that issue. So it wasn't necessarily the particular project types were identified as a priority. It might have been shoreline development or stream crossings, and then we would go out and look at something like bridges. In terms of hydro facilities or dams, are you talking about IPP projects, like independent power projects, or BC Hydro projects?
Well, I'm just talking about larger scale projects that we didn't hear you make mention of.
Oh, okay. I mean, there were a number of large scale projects that monitoring was conducted on, things like the Sea to Sky Highway, the Delta Port development, a number of large projects were also included in the monitoring. And again, there was a potential, if there had been an authorization in place for one of the hydro projects, that it could have come up as part of the monitoring. I'm not aware of any of the hydro facilities that did, but could well have.
Is part of the project, or part of the process rather, for determining these strategic priorities, is part of that process receiving and responding to concerns perhaps from First Nations or NGOs, and then your area staff bringing that to the table's attention?
Yes, I think that it would be, yes.
Mr. Bissett, could you turn up number 5 from our list of documents, please? Mr. Carter, this is a discussion paper that was prepared by one of our clients, Russ Jones, and it's entitled A Scoping of Aboriginal Implications of Renewal of the Fisheries Act 1985. Mr. Jones prepared it for the Assembly of First Nations in March of 2006. So first of all, I'll ask you if you've seen this document before.
No, I'm sorry, I have not.
All right, I'm just going to take you to a couple of parts of the document. Do you know Mr. Jones, or have you had occasion to work with him?
Mr. Jones. I don't believe that I do.
All right. Just by way of explanation, Mr. Jones is one of our clients. He's also a council member from the First Nations Fisheries Council. He's a Haida hereditary chief, a member of the Council of Haida Nation. He's also a member, or a commissioner rather, from the Pacific Salmon Commission.
Oh, okay.
So that's his background. And I'll bring you first of all, please, to page 35, which lays out the context for this part of his paper, which he identifies as priority habitat management issues. And then on the next page, page 36, heading 4, in his view, one of the priority habitat management issues is to promote enhanced First Nations roles in habitat monitoring and enforcement. And I'm wondering if you agree that an enhanced role for First Nations to work with DFO with monitoring would be a useful thing, a positive thing.
I think it would be a positive thing. You know, as mentioned before, you know, doing some of this work in partnerships with other entities only increases the capacity and the opportunity for doing things well. So I think it would be beneficial. So.
Right, and I would think that particularly in light of the evidence that we've heard about the staffing and resourcing challenges that the department faces, having participation from First Nations could be beneficial.
Yes.
And just flipping over to page 34, we note there that Mr. Jones makes reference to some First Nations in the Atlantic and Pacific region involved in habitat monitoring through the AFS, the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any First Nations in the Pacific region that are currently, or perhaps have been in the recent past, engaged in habitat monitoring activities.
I know of instances where First Nations have been involved in the monitoring associated with specific projects. But I don't know of, I don't know whether that occurred through the AFS or not. But I do know of First Nations being involved in the monitoring of projects.
All right, and are you able to speak to any specifics?
I'd be hard pressed. I do believe First Nations were involved in some of the monitoring on the Toba Montrose independent power project. That would be one instance, but beyond that.
And it's, I'll leave it at that, thank you.
Sure.
If that document could be entered as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 681.
And finally, then, I just have a few questions in respect of ecosystem monitoring, and these arise from some of your answers earlier today. And we've heard about how ecosystem monitoring is on DFO's horizon in the future, and you estimated that the work plan, that you hope that work might be completed or in place perhaps around 2013. And we also heard from you earlier that developing the indicators and the sampling and monitoring regime is something that's going to be primarily on the science branch's plate.
I think there is an expectation that science will take the lead in providing a lot of the guidance for the
Right.
development of that. Habitat will be involved as well, obviously, but leaning to the expertise of science in terms of the development of those programs.
Right. And in terms of developing those programs, do you see any room there for collaboration or partnering with academic institutions or environmental groups and First Nations to move this ecosystem monitoring work ahead and perhaps be able to do so within that somewhat optimistic time frame?
I think there's opportunities for it. Yes, and I think, in terms of the development, having some discussion and, I guess consultation about how to involve others.
Right, and that's actually leads into my last question, which is whether you can offer a recommendation on how such collaborative efforts, and let's say with First Nations, could best move ahead.
I guess that I'm scratching my head a little bit on that. I think when it comes to the development of the wild salmon policy and developing some of the initiatives under that might be a good forum to have some of those discussions. And, whether they be workshops or some way of gathering people from different areas together to discuss what are the opportunities and what the roles that various entities could play. But beyond that, not really my area of expertise.
All right, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I have Ms. Robertson at 10 minutes now.
A few questions for you, Mr. Carter. I'm wondering if your branch ever monitors salmon aquaculture sites.
Currently, we are not monitoring aquaculture sites. My understanding is that the monitoring of the aquaculture sites is being conducted by staff working in the aquaculture office. So.
And have you ever been, there's been a fair bit of discussion today about the assessment of priorities. Have you ever been involved in any discussions where there was a consideration as to whether your branch should be considering that as a priority, or has it?
I was involved in one meeting with staff from the aquaculture office discussing sort of monitoring and approaches to monitoring, and a discussion about trying to ensure that the standards and the approaches were similar, but that would be the only discussion.
And what of that? Are the standards and approaches similar, as far as you know, or?
I'm really not aware of the standards and approaches that are being applied, so.
So they may or may not be similar.
Yes.
And another question, just generally, do you find when you're working with a letter of advice, as opposed to when you're working with a HAD mitigation agreement?
An authorization?
An HAD authorization,
Yes.
or an agreement whereby the proponent undertakes to do certain things to avoid a HAD.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you find that an adaptive management approach is better facilitated by a letter of advice or by an actual HAD agreement in terms of your ability to monitor?
Okay. Well, I'm not familiar with the term HAD agreement. I'm assuming that would be an authorization under the Act, under Section 35. Normally, authorizations do include conditions directly associated with monitoring. So there's some required monitoring under the authorization, which isn't normally the case under a letter of advice. So there is, I guess, an increased effort in monitoring in association with authorizations on the proponent side. In terms of adaptive management and whether one is more effective on one or the other, again, normally letters of advice don't include conditions associated with adaptive management, but I have seen a number of authorizations where there are conditions associated with adaptive management.
Okay.
So, yes.
So generally, you're saying when there's a letter of advice issued with respect to a project, it's more difficult on the monitoring end of things to engage in adaptive management, meaning the ability to make kind of changes as the work progresses in the operational phase, to make changes where assessments determine that there's uncertainty, at least with respect to fish habitat impacts.
I haven't seen a lot of adaptive management in association with letters of advice, so I think I would, agree with your statement that it doesn't tend to occur with letters of advice, whereas I have seen it with authorizations. So,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And my final question is, in terms of doing the assessments, Do you ever engage with First Nations in terms of traditional ecological knowledge around their insights as to whether or not advice is working, monitoring is working in terms of impacts they're seeing on fisheries?
There's been some discussion with regards to particular projects where First Nations have been involved in those projects, and that there have been some discussions, but as a general principle, not regularly. Not that that wouldn't necessarily be something that would be worthwhile.
And would that be a capacity issue or a policy issue or both? Or what would be the barriers to taking that?
I think part of it, we're still building the toolbox. So that's part of it as well, in terms of what to incorporate in here. There's still a lot of work going on in developing the monitoring initiative. So as to who will be our, who will collaborate with us or how we'll collaborate with different groups, that's still developing. So
But you do think that would be a helpful tool?
I think it bears consideration, yes. I think there's a potential for it to be beneficial, yes.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, I believe Ms. Tesoro has 1 point to cover in re-examination. Mr. Taylor has 2, but otherwise that should conclude our evidence through the day.
I wonder if I could just raise just a couple of quick points, Mr. Martland, and then Ms. Tesoro or Mr. Taylor may want to include that in their questions. And I'm not sure quite how to articulate this, Mr. Carter, so I apologize in advance if the questions seem a little convoluted. Insofar as DFO is concerned and the different elements of DFO responsible for management of the fishery, do you meet from time to time with all of your colleagues for example, we've heard evidence since January on harvest management, including the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery, and we will be having a panel on the Aboriginal fishing as well. So they've dealt with different elements of their responsibility.
Right.
Be it escapement strategy or whatever. You're now talking about the area of monitoring, for example, and compliance, but do you and your colleagues come together and share your experiences and the information that's available in sort of an overarching management discussion as to how the different parts of the puzzle fit together within the management? And obviously this commission's concerned about salmon and Fraser River sockeye. So I should be really, in fairness to you, really addressing this question to within Fraser River sockeye issues. Do you have an opportunity to come together and have those kinds of discussions?
There are discussions that have occurred where various elements of the department or the various branches do meet, whether it be SARA or Oceans or FAM, with Habitat over discussing various issues. So those kind of discussions do happen. An overarching discussion of sort of management of a particular stock, I'm not aware of a discussion like that occurring, other than maybe under the framework of the wild salmon policy, where you've got those different stages within the, sections within the wild salmon policy, and various groups are engaged in those various strategies, and there are discussions that occur under that banner where I think along those lines that may or has been happening.
I see. So it would be a matter of someone inviting you to come to a particular meeting to address an issue like that under the wild salmon policy.
Yes, and I do know that there have been discussions like that under wild salmon policy where FAM and Habitat and SARA have been meeting to discuss implementation of the wild salmon policy.
Okay. And my other question, again, I apologize in advance, I may not be articulating this very well, but I understand that policies are developed at the national level. There's input from the regional level. There may even be drafts done at the regional level and so on. But in that process, you've had a lot of questions put to you by these lawyers with regard to staffing issues and that sort of area and funding issues. Do you get an opportunity during the lead up to a discussion paper being published or a strategy document or a framework document being published to have a thorough analysis of what the impacts will be from adopting that particular discussion or a policy or framework to your staff resources, your human and financial resources? In other words, is that part of the mix in the lead up to these kinds of documents being adopted by DFO?
I can only speak from my personal experience.
Of course.
There have been instances where we have been asked to engage on policy under development or, to provide our sort of 2 cents worth. There have also been other instances where things have rolled out in relatively short order and maybe there hasn't been as much opportunity. So it varies.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I've now got 3.5 questions of you. You answered a question of Mr. Harvey as to monitoring to do with Cultus Lake in 2010. You'll recall that. And I think what you said was that if there was a project, it would likely have been caught, but you don't recall there being a project
Well, it
last year.
would have had the potential to have been caught, yes.
And in terms of monitoring by certainly your unit, when you answered that question of Mr. Harvey, were you referring to the work that your unit would or would not have done, or were you including all of Habitat and all of the Habitat staff in your answer?
Yeah, good point. I mean, my answer would have been framed around the work that was being done by the Habitat Monitoring Unit. So, but you're right, there are other Habitat staff that may have been involved in monitoring.
And more specifically, there are Habitat staff assigned to the Cultus area, to your knowledge?
Yes, there are.
And would I also be correct then that your answer was not speaking to what the enforcement branch might or might not be doing?
That's correct as well.
That leads to a related question. Where you have larger projects, would it be the case that a habitat biologist is going to have a file open on it?
Yes, it is.
And that habitat biologist will be looking at it and monitoring that particular larger project?
The reality is they would have, I guess, a responsibility with regards to follow-up monitoring of a project that they may have reviewed, but the Habitat Monitoring Unit might be looking at doing monitoring in association with that project as well.
So you might both be doing it?
Exactly. And, obviously we were trying to do that monitoring jointly.
But my question was really going to whether on a larger project, no matter what, you're going to see a habitat biologist on it.
You're going to see a habitat biologist involved in the review of it. Whether there's, whether that habitat biologist goes out and conducts monitoring on it, that might depend.
Okay. Mr. Rosenblum pointed out that there's been one conviction, and no doubt we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next couple of days, or over the next couple of days. Apart from conviction, well, firstly, it almost goes without saying, but one conviction presumably means there's at least one prosecution and probably more than one prosecution. Some prosecutions don't result in a conviction.
That's correct.
But besides the prosecution tool and convictions, are there other compliance tools that can be employed by fisheries staff or habitat staff?
That's a good point. If we were to consider in that compliance decision framework the various responses of the department that are laid out in that framework or that policy document, it speaks about a continuum of actions in relation to compliance. And, on one end of the spectrum, promotion, education, advice, all of those can be used as tools to bring about compliance with the Act. Moving through to the continuum to shifting more and more towards the compel side, where you might, issue an inspector's direction or a warning, or the enforce side, where you may conduct an investigation and do an enforcement action. So there's a broad range of tools that can be brought to bear to try and ensure that if habitat's being impacted, that impact is addressed.
Now, do inspectors' direction offer the opportunity for the monitoring habitat official to give a direction that then allows them to have an ongoing review and clout, if you like, over that? In other words, the direction is to do something and to do it within a certain time or stop doing it, and then there's further checks on that and maybe ongoing even beyond that.
There would be a follow-up, and I guess the conditions or the directions provided in that inspector's directions are in themselves enforceable.
And is it your understanding that a conviction would simply result in a fine and/or jail, potentially, I suppose, but a fine that's then paid perhaps as a cost of doing business, and that's the end of the clout.
There is that potential.
Now, the commissioner asked you a couple of questions a moment or so ago about meeting or consultation or dialogue is between the various units or branches within fisheries in BC, and you gave an answer. You've referred already to area staff, and those are habitat staff, and then there's other section or unit staff in those area offices, isn't there?
Absolutely, yes.
And do you have knowledge whether they dialogue amongst each other?
I have knowledge that yes, they do.
Yeah.
And, the expectation is that it happens on a fairly frequent basis.
They're all working in an office together
Exactly.
for the same common goal.
Hopefully, yes.
And at the other level of the hierarchy, but still within the region, are you aware, well, firstly, you report to a regional director, correct?
Through a regional manager, yes.
And all staff except CMP report to a regional director, don't they?
The CMP staff would report to their own regional director, but yes, yeah.
Well, CMP report to Sue Farlinger, the regional director general, right?
Yes, though Randy Nelson falls there in that chain of command
Oh,
somewhere.
what I
too.
mean is
Yeah.
through Randy Nelson.
Yes,
And all other staff report through someone to a regional director.
yes.
And then, am I correct that Randy Nelson is the head of CMP, and the regional directors and Sue Farlinger, they all get together regularly, don't they?
Yes,
And you don't know what they talk about, but you know they talk about fisheries business.
I would assume so, yes.
Thank you.
Area of redirect is simply to be clear on the issue of anticipated timelines for incorporating fish health habitat or ecosystem monitoring into the habitat management program, because I fear the record may not actually be clear on that point. And to aid this effort, Mr. Bizzett, if you could pull up what was tab 15 of our materials and is now exhibit 676. And my questions, Mr. Carter, focus on this first page under the heading longer term 2013 to 2015. I'd like to have you clarify what the timeline is for implementing, or the anticipated timeline for implementing these elements. And I've heard you say, in response to a question from Mr. Taylor, that the timeline for implementing the, and correct me if I'm wrong, for implementing the final box, which is a box that reads science development of ecosystem indicators to determine whether cumulative effects and other ecosystem level issues are being addressed, is 4 to 5 years.
Yes.
Is that correct?
When you look at this national document, developing those national indicators and looking at that longer time frame of 4 to 5 years, yes, you are correct, but those are the national indicators. I think you're also correct in assuming, though, that under the wild salmon policy, there are regional indicators that have been developed and that already exist, right?
And on that point, do you know how the National Habitat Management Program's timeline for developing ecosystem indicators for monitoring fits with the wild salmon policy indicator timeline? And maybe, Mr. Bizzett, just so that wild salmon policy timeline can be on the screen as well, if you could pull exhibit 8, and it's page 23 in the real document, which I think is about 31-ish. Go back, there we go, and it's under step 3.1. So when you refer to the regional ecosystem indicator timeline, are you talking about the line here, Mr. Carter, where it says within 2 years an ecosystem monitoring and assessment approach will be developed and integrated with ongoing assessments?
So you're reading this paragraph 3.1?
Yes, under the heading identify indicators to monitor status of freshwater ecosystems.
Okay. And my understanding is that those indicators have already been developed? That
And-
they already exist?
Who do you understand did that work?
That would be the report that was generated by Heather Stahlberg.
So you understand Ms. Stahlberg's work to be under Strategy 3?
I thought that was under Strategy 2 with regards to developing sort of habitat indicators or status indicators.
So here I think we are under Action Step 3.1, under
Okay.
Strategy 3.
Key indicators, biological, physical, and chemical of current and potential state of lake and stream ecosystems. So yeah, whether they fall under Strategy 2 or Strategy 3, I'm not. I would say that I know that there have been a suite of indicators that have been developed and have gone through a peer review process. So,
On the point of the degree to which, and the processes by which Habitat Management and Science Branch coordinate on wild salmon policy implementation, particularly with respect to monitoring, who do you have a counterpart or contact at Science that you speak to about, for example, Action Step 3.1? Do you yourself engage in that kind of inter-branch consultation?
there is a colleague that I work with that is taking the lead on wild salmon policy on behalf of Habitat, and I do have a significant amount of discussion with her. There are specific scientists that I engage with, but I'm not the science liaison between Habitat and Science. There's another individual who plays that role that I again have interaction with. So.
And you're talking about Melody Farrell?
Melody Farrell on the wild salmon policy side, and Derek Nishimura when it comes to the science liaison.
And I suppose, I guess my last question, just on the same theme, is your evidence is that you understand that this ecosystem monitoring and assessment approach referred to here is already.
Well, the indicators have been identified. How those indicators will be applied, that is work that is still ongoing. So developing a framework under which those indicators would be monitored and that information would be gathered is still ongoing work.
Okay.
Does that make
Unless you have any questions for the witness, Mr. Commissioner, I think that concludes the evidence of this witness, and we'll adjourn to 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cyril, appreciate that. And thanks to the witness for appearing here today and for answering the questions of counsel. Thank you very much. Welcome. We're adjourned then until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and that is to commence the panel on enforcement, is that correct?
Yes, our panel commencing tomorrow, continuing Friday and Monday is habitat enforcement.
Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day and resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.